Thanks for joining us for today's episode. But before we start the show, just a quick reminder that in addition to our podcast feed, we also sponsor events in physical places like live podcasts, panel discussions, and programs featuring art, music, film, and other such mediums. And we also host live events online where listeners are welcome to join in. Check out our website to see if we have any live events coming up to a place near you or any virtual events you can join in as well. Or maybe you have an idea for collaboration. Feel free to get in touch with us and share your thoughts. But for now, let's get into the show. Patrick Phongsathorn, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Inside Myanmar podcast.
It's my pleasure.
So this is a very interesting conversation we're having. This is in the history of our platform. This is the very first conversation that we have had in front of an audience. So we are speaking as we always do to our guests, but as we do, we have the gravity of many other ears that are here joining us and listening alongside. And those guests will also be potentially contributing to questions and engagements as we go along, as we have this conversation. So even though the listening audience out there hearing this in audio form, some months later from when we're talking, may not see or hear them, there is an audience that is here joining us. And so with that preamble, as we often do with our guests on Inside Myanmar podcast, we will be getting to some of your later documentation, the work you've been doing at Fortify Rights, the recent updates from Myanmar. We will be getting to all of that. As we often like to do in Inside Myanmar podcast, we like to get to know the guest first. And so we'd like to get to know how you came to this field, how you came to work on Myanmar, to care about human rights and democracy, and the work that you're doing. So if you could take us back to your primary interest in where you started to go into this direction.
Sure. Okay. Thanks very much, Joe, and thanks for having me. And thanks to everyone here in the audience for joining. It's a real honor to be part of this first live audience podcast with Inside Myanmar. I suppose I don't even really remember where my interest in this kind of work came from. It was always kind of there. I think my father's from Thailand and my mother's Irish, South African. We have a lot of different nationalities in our family. And so I think that growing up, I was always exposed to the outside world, despite growing up in very rural, suburban kind of setting in the UK, just outside of London. The conversations around the dinner table were always about what was happening here in Thailand or what was happening internationally. And so, or also, UK politics as well. So I guess that's where it came from, and that tradition that unfortunately I think is dying out these days of families gathering together around dinner table and discussing current affairs and things like that. So I grew up with that, which was, I think, where it kind of all started. I also am a child of the late 80s, 90s, where it's a very different time, even though it's not that long ago. It feels like it was a very different time where there was hope in the international system, where the United Nations was quite a kind of strong player on the scene, whether it was in East Timor or the former Yugoslavia or places, in Africa and South America. The UN, did seem to have a moral authority, political weight, and even, kind of peacekeeping forces that they could deploy. And, I think particularly kind of standing out in my memory growing up in the UK was what was happening in Bosnia and in the former Yugoslavia and taking note of that. And the UK's role in some of those crises as well. And so all of that was in the news whilst I was growing up, and I took a keen interest in that. And then subsequently, my life took a little bit of a detour in that my father's a doctor, my mum's a nurse, and I'm the youngest out of 3 children. And my brother is an editor working in the arts. My sister's an artist, and I thought I better try at least to go into medicine. But so I in the UK, you have to choose quite early on your career path. You have to start deciding around the age of 16, for instance, if you want to be a doctor, because you have to take certain subjects as you go through your education. So I had to kind of deny all of my best instincts to go with social studies and politics and religious studies and things like that. And I went down the maths, science route. But by the end of my time at school, or what should have been the end of my time at school, it was clearly apparent that I was terrible at those things, and that if I ever became a doctor, I would quickly kill my first patient. So the school called me in after a terrible set of exam results and said, well, we know that you have, potential to go far, but you're just doing the wrong subjects and you're denying your natural instincts. And they were exactly right. And so then I had to redo my last year of secondary school, high school, and I switched to doing politics and French and religious studies and sociology, and it went a lot more smoothly. And then after that, I went to the School of Orient and African Studies, which is a small university in the UK, in London, where it was my top choice, my dream university, mainly because of that international outlook and the fact that people came from all over the world to study at SOAS. Including many people from Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Thailand, elsewhere. And so I felt that was a kind of natural home for me as a mixed race person, interested in international affairs and politics. And when I went to visit, it just clicked. And so then from that moment, I was really keen going to SOAS and managed to get in, study politics. And I was there for 3 years. And then after that, I went straight into a master's degree in Paris, actually, at Sciences Po, which is a very different kind of institution to SOAS. SOAS is very left-wing, is very militant in many ways, whereas Sciences Po is a very elite school in Paris where most French presidents and prime ministers go and study. So it had a very different feeling, but I think that the level of seriousness and kind of academic rigor was the same in both places, but there was just a different outlook, which was really good. And I think it helped me to kind of balance my own personal politics and perspectives on things by getting both sides of the argument in a way. And there I was part of the first intake for their human rights and humanitarian action program. So it was started by Ronnie Brauman, who was one of the founders of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. And he, as well as being a physician, is also a very deep thinker about human rights and about humanitarianism. And so he was a really excellent person to start that course. But we also had lots of it was a very practical approach. Actually, we had lots of practitioners. So we had Anya Neistat and Ollie Solvang from Human Rights Watch, who were part of the emergencies team at Human Rights Watch. They came in and taught one semester. We had William Shabas, who kind of infamously went on to go and represent Aung San Suu Kyi at the ICJ case. And we had many other wonderful professors and practitioners who came in and talked to us about and taught us the kind of basics of doing human rights work and doing humanitarian work and some of the moral kind of qualms and challenges around both of those areas of work. So that was a very exciting program to be part of. After that, ended up going back to London, just because that seemed like the natural next step. And I'd gotten an internship at Human Rights Watch that I was doing alongside some work with a group within the Labour Party in the UK who works on human rights policy. So I was doing those 2 internships in London for the best part of a year. For Human Rights Watch, I was working on the issue of immigration detention in Thailand, actually specifically looking at the situation of refugee children in immigration detention centers here and helping them to translate documents from Thai to English and analyze some of those findings that they had. But London was never really, I don't think, the place I was going to make my career as a human rights defender and a humanitarian. So we decided, me and my then girlfriend, now wife, that we would take the risk and go all the way over to the other side of the world, to East Timor, which was one of those places that was kind of on my radar in the 90s, as a crisis zone. But at that point, had calmed down. There was still, turbulence, but it was largely calm, and there were some opportunities out there. My mother-in-law was working out there, and she said, there's lots of jobs. If you're interested in humanitarian work, please, there's plenty of opportunities. So I went out there, and I ended up getting a consultancy with the International Organization for Migration, working on labor migration in particular. So looking at flows of Timorese workers going to Korea, going to Australia, going to the UK, and working with the government to kind of put in place a plan of action, basically, about how to manage those flows and how to make sure that everyone does that safely and regularly, and there's no exploitation along the routes and at the destination. And it was a great experience in Timor because we're a very small office. I was one of, I think, 3 international staff, and then there were probably 9 or 10 local staff. And so, when my boss was away, I would be deputizing him for him as the chief of mission, which is crazy because I was, 23, 24 years old. It was completely inappropriate. But Timor was so small, and there was so few of us there that kind of we all had to play lots of different roles. And so it gave me a lot of exposure to different areas of work, including human trafficking, labor migration, immigration control systems, and also a lot of exposure to the government there, because it being a country of only 1.1 million, everyone basically knows each other, especially in the capital. And, the first week I saw the Prime Minister, who's a famous resistance leader, Junana Gushmao. He was out on the street smoking and directing traffic, and that's the kind of place that East Timor is. It's a very friendly, very welcoming, very warm place. So I was there for about a year and a half. And then after that, I got another job in another UN agency, UNHCR, which is the refugee agency, to go and work on the Syria crisis, based in Beirut, Lebanon. And I was working in their external relations department. So I was helping to fundraise, I was helping to deal with governments, deal with diplomats, to manage those relationships, essentially. And Beirut was a wonderful place to live. Different challenges, in some ways more challenging than East Timor. A very complex history of civil war and sectarian division. And at that moment, when we were there, quite unstable. They hadn't had a government for a long, long time. The trash wasn't being collected. The electricity was going in and out all day. The basic services that you would expect most governments to perform weren't being performed. And on top of that, they had 1 million Syrians, in camps and in informal settlements that they had to help manage and help to assist as well at that time. And so it was a much more stressful work, but it was very, very rewarding as well. And it was another kind of a very different operation to East Timor, where we were just a handful of people. This was the biggest UN operation in the world at the time, and we had a budget of about $500 million. Money was flowing in from left, right, and center more quickly than we could spend it sometimes, which is a challenge in humanitarianism, actually. Yes, I had a very enjoyable but quite intense period in the Middle East. And then after that, both me and my wife we said, okay, now we need a bit of we need to slow down again. So we decided to come to Thailand, which is a place that we both know very well. As I said, I'm half Thai, half British, and I grew up coming out here on long summer holidays, kind of every other year, when funds allowed. And so it was very familiar to me, and I have family here. And my wife was actually born here. She's British American, but she was born here and then she grew up in Laos. And so this region and Thailand, Bangkok, is, in many ways, her home. So for both of us, it was a homecoming. And I'm lucky enough to have an uncle who is involved in, he's a businessman, but he's involved in a lot of social works in Thailand. He has 3 different foundations, and he had work for us to do for him. So my wife worked in education and I worked in anti-corruption. And then after a couple of years there, I got the job at Fortify Rights. So I was back in 2019. So I've been with Fortify Rights now for a long time, for the longest period of my kind of career. This has been the longest posting. And I started off actually as the M&E person in the organization. And then after a couple of years of that, I transitioned to my current work, which is as an advocacy specialist. So what I do in the team is to both advocate directly myself, but also to build the capacity of our team and our partners to advocate as well. So, things like how to make submissions to governments or parliaments, how to conduct advocacy meetings effectively, advice on communications, and advice on strategy, all those kinds of things.
Mm. It's great hearing that overall trajectory that you give to your initial studies and family upbringing all the way through to these different environments and then on to Thailand, and weaving some of those stories together. I'm particularly interested in how some come together. So we have, your initial inclination to want to care and want to go into this field. And it might be a straightforward question, but it also might be one of those things you have to go back in time to unpack, is just where that volition came from, where that desire, that thought of all the things that I could do in the world, moving towards this direction and doing this type of work. That's something that really matters to me, and wanting to go and to look at that and dig up why would that matter? Where did that come from? But then as that journey goes along, what I'm also interested in, 2 other things you said, is that you contrasted the more rules-based order and optimism and international community and UN engagement, international scene at the time, at that time in the 90s, we can say, to what we're seeing today is very different. And so this volition that you brought into the world, that world has changed. Perhaps the volition has also changed too, or morphed as it's gone into different kind of work and experiences. But that context that you're doing this work in and engaged has changed dramatically in this period of time. Then the other contrast in there that's interesting is you talk about the more left-leaning SOAS and the more right-leaning Science Po. And I think that this also fleshes out, I think for those of us that are, or for those listeners who don't really know what it means to be a human rights defender or to work in this field, there might be a somewhat monolithic way of looking at it, of just like, oh, well, you go and help people. You go and make things right. You go and find out what's unfair and you try to figure out how to make it fair. But, I think that for those that are really in this field academically and the practical nature, there are many different ways to go about this. There are many different theoretical approaches to, and, sort of as we're jumping ahead, but as we get to Myanmar and the case that this has kind of broken the brains of many in the international system and the need to think outside of that, there are many different ways to look at what it means to do this work and what the approach is and what the aims are.
So I think that to work in human rights and humanitarianism, obviously I think that a lot of people would think you need to care about the people that you're helping. And I completely agree. You need a level of empathy, obviously. You don't want to be a sociopath and work in this industry. That wouldn't be a good fit. But I think there needs to be more than that. I think that you need to be genuinely interested and curious about the problems that people face. You want to solve those problems to the best of your ability, but also you have to have an understanding that you won't be able to solve it entirely, and there'll be some things that will, they'll always be unresolved. And injustice, unfortunately, is a part of life. And I think that's something that I've grown to understand better. I think when I was younger, I was a lot more radical, a lot more political, and a lot more righteous, self-righteous in many respects. I would go on, several, during my time at school, several kind of crusades against various things that were happening in my community. I was often writing to my member of parliament. I was often petitioning the school for various things. But because I have always had this kind of keen sense of what's right and wrong, I suppose, and that I could contribute to trying to move things more towards the right end of the scale. But I think that, and I think in the 90s that was a genuine feeling, and I think there was a widespread kind of a feeling that you could, as an individual and as a movement, you could change the world. We had the Make Poverty History campaign. We had, in the UK, we had various charity campaigns that, people would get involved with. And we had political leaders who seemed to share that kind of vision and were providing that kind of moral clarity and vision, even though, what we've learned subsequently is that there was never entirely that moral clarity. I mean, in the UK, for instance, we had a Foreign Minister, Robin Cook, who talked about an ethical foreign policy. He made a big speech about how the UK must have more of a focus on human rights, more of a focus on the ethics behind their foreign policy. And that unraveled very quickly, unfortunately, in the UK. We have a big arms industry. We have strategic interests that need to be fulfilled. And so having a foreign policy that was solely based on human rights and justice perhaps was never going to work and didn't work. And so I think that, I think over the years I've kind of refined things. And the reason that I like how we do human rights work at Fortify Rights so much is that we lead with that kind of curiosity, I think. We want to find out everything we can about a certain situation that we're looking into. We really do go into a lot of depth in our investigations. If you read our reports, they're many, many pages long, sometimes too long in my perspective. But they really do go into a lot of depth, and we do a lot of back and forth and challenging each other about the integrity of what we are saying and whether we can say things publicly, whether we feel confident enough to put things out there into the public domain and face scrutiny, especially in this region where it's difficult for us to do this work. So we need to be especially careful, we think, in what we say and how we say it, so that we are always accurate and we always balanced as well. And you touched in your question about how different organizations take different approaches to human rights. And I think you're right in that, obviously the human rights movement is, in many respects, kind of can find its roots perhaps within the left-wing political ideology, socialism, social democracy. But I think that it's important, to the extent that everyone can, when you do this work, to shelve your personal political, or your beliefs in general. And to the extent that's possible, obviously there will always remain a natural bias and an unconscious bias in all of us when we do this work. But to the best extent possible, we need to shelve those and to try and present as balanced a picture as possible. Now, there are some groups who maybe stray more into the political side of things, and they may, align themselves more with one side or the other in their work. But we strive not to do that. We strive to present a balanced picture, an accurate picture, we think, and one that's very much grounded in international law. That's our kind of starting point, whether it's human rights law or the laws of war. We always kind of start with that as our jump-off point, basically, and then it's a kind of quite a rigorous process of fact-finding and then applying those facts to the relevant law, much like a court or a lawyer would, in domestic courts and in international courts as well. And so and that's why our work has been used by legal processes, both domestically and internationally, because it does often kind of meet that level of evidentiary standards and admissibility in legal processes. So I think that's what I appreciate very much about our approach to human rights work.
Just as we're tracing, again, this journey that you're having into this field, trying to understand the field better so that then we can bring that analysis to the Myanmar work that you've done, I want to go back and ask about some of the growth that you've personally and professionally achieved and the learning moments you've had along the way. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning the kind of self-righteous anger and, down with the system kind of thing, like we need to, this fury that only youth can have in terms of believing that you must know the only real possible solution and everyone else needs to understand it. But then, and I think that's a good starting point for looking at injustice and wanting to get involved, and then going through a maturation process, a learning process, educational, being practical in the field. And you've gone through this in so many contexts up until now. Is there an anecdote or an incident that you can share that represented that learning moment for you, where some light bulb clicked, or you had some awareness that some approach you were doing needed to be refined, needed to be matured, needed to be improved in some way that would help us understand your evolution of how you've gotten to the position and the work that you're doing now and the way that you're engaging?
I think it wasn't a single moment. I mean, there's been, I think, a series of kind of moments in my career, in my life, which have led to that self-righteousness being kind of diluted somewhat. But I think you do still need that kind of fire within you. And I think everyone who I work with will also tell you that I still have a fire. Obviously, I think if that fire goes out entirely, then you probably should find another career path. But I think it's important that fire doesn't consume you as well. I think you have to be able to you have to try and be empathetic. I think you have to engage in a dialogue, and I think that's what sometimes self-righteous teenagers fail to do, is that you have to try and see things from other people's perspectives. You have to try and see where they're coming from to then be and that will actually improve your advocacy as well. Like if you understand, where other people are coming from, then you will be able to speak to their hearts a lot more effectively. And so I think it's a practical thing as well as being a kind of maturing process. But I think it's also just through being exposed to people in different situations, whether that is, a hospital director in Lebanon who's struggling to cope with the influx of Syrian refugees, dealing with not only their Lebanese casework, but also now, Syrians with all kinds of complex medical issues, and just being frustrated that they're not getting the help that they need, or a feeling that this wasn't something that they chose to have to deal with, but that's the situation they're in, or especially I think if you work outside of the West, there's a very different perspective on right and wrong as well. That comes from different histories, that comes from different religions, that comes from different understandings of how the world works as well. And I think that from moving away from the UK, from the West, and being based out in the countries that I've worked in, you quickly realize that there's more to the picture than meets the eye first, especially from the perspective sitting in London and watching TV basically, and reading newspapers, British newspapers. If you leave that and go and talk to people outside of that bubble, you realize that there are very different and diverse perspectives, and that they're not crazy, they're not stupid, they're just coming from a different perspective, and a perspective that needs to be acknowledged. And I think that's what we see as well happening at a global level now, with the kind of breakdown of the international order as we knew it in the 90s. We are seeing now the emergence of different perspectives of how the world should work, how the international order should be, coming to the fore. And they're becoming more and more clear about, what that looks like, especially as the US seemingly seems to be ceding its supremacy and hegemony over those kinds of discussions and seems to be rejecting everything that it's previously embraced at the UN and NATO and other, international fora. So I think getting comfortable with different perspectives and different beliefs around right and wrong is a process that I've gone through and is a process that we'll all now have to confront as the world changes.
So then let's go to Myanmar now, and it's interesting looking at your multicultural background along with your extensive experience in Syria and East Timor, and Fortify Rights since the coup has been very much involved in Myanmar, which we'll get into those details in terms of how. But as you started to approach some of the issues that you would be dealing with in Myanmar, any number of atrocities and illicit activities, human rights violations, et cetera, looking at those diverse communities that you were involved in before, and as you say, trying to understand from the ground level, from the local level, just the differences in ways and culture and people, how that can manifest and how you have to work with that and how you have to get very sensitive work done, often as an outsider, asserting yourself as an outsider, bringing one sense of right and wrong into it while also trying to understand theirs and trying to find solutions from very difficult contexts. What lessons did you learn from those previous work experiences that you came to find that you could apply in Myanmar, and then what in Myanmar was kind of wholly different that you had to you had to improvise and adapt that nothing in the background had prepared you for, if anything?
Yeah. So I think I want to kind of give a precaution before I continue to speak, is that I'm not a Myanmar expert. I wouldn't call myself a Myanmar expert to any extent. I've only really worked on the country for the past 3 or 4 years. Directly, and so I think that's important to start off with. But I think that the most important people that I've spoken to about Myanmar are Myanmar people, obviously. They are the ones, whenever I get the opportunity to speak with refugees now, basically, and some people still inside the country, but mainly refugees, I always come away with a lot of ideas, a lot of different perspectives, a lot of things that I didn't know were happening and, really need to be looked into on both sides of the border, because I'm based here in Thailand and, we do a lot of work on the refugee situation of Myanmar refugees in Thailand as well. So I think, it's that as the starting point, understanding their stories and their perspectives and what the challenges that they're facing are. I think that's a good place for us to start the conversation about then human rights and international law and kind of things like that. But understanding just the daily challenges and the specific kind of abuses that they've seen and suffered is the first place to start, and then we can look to apply relevant law and make judgments on right and wrong, through that process. So I think a big difference is that I was working on the refugee situation in Lebanon, so Syrians coming over the border and seeking safety in Lebanon. So I wasn't working directly on the conflict inside Syria. And Lebanon, even though it has a terrible history of civil war and has been recently attacked, continues to be attacked by Israel, at that time when I was there, there wasn't any active conflict happening within the Lebanese territory. So we were dealing with a refugee situation and not directly working on the conflict and the drivers of the conflict. Same for Timor. Timor had been through its war of independence from Indonesia, had been through a brief period of kind of civil war, essentially, and had gone through the period of international intervention. And when I was there, it was a burgeoning democracy, trying to get systems up and running. The government was kind of working out its different policies, and that's what we were there to help with. And so again, it was a kind of post-conflict situation. Myanmar, what we were doing in Myanmar is working directly on the conflict, the drivers of the conflict, the consequences of the conflict, and very importantly for us, accountability, long-term accountability for the acts that have happened both since the coup in 2021, but we've been working on Myanmar for more than a decade now. And so we've been looking at all kinds of different abuses that have happened in Myanmar, not least the Rohingya genocide. And so it's quite different in that respect. But I think that what I bring from my time in Lebanon, time in East Timor, is perhaps that idea that the conflict will subside eventually, and we need to think about what will happen the day after the conflict ends, and also the subsequent days. There has to be some sustainable peace in Myanmar. And what does that look like? Well, there has to be a political process, obviously, but there must also be accountability. And we've seen that in Lebanon, and we've seen that in East Timor as well, where there have been efforts to bring international criminals to justice, to bring people who have committed atrocities to answer for their crimes. And that takes different forms. There are so many different examples of transitional and post-conflict justice that we can draw on, from South Africa to Rwanda to the former Yugoslavia. There are all kinds of different models and ways of doing that. But essentially, I think what we have learned from the 90s and from those conflicts, and what I've personally seen, is that if you don't reconcile the injustices that people face, then they will come back. They will bubble under the surface and they will come back. And I think East Timor did a good job at reckoning with its past, its very sad history, and dealing with the crimes that happened on both sides to a large extent. Lebanon didn't. Lebanon, they had to kind of essentially freeze the conflict and freeze these sectarian divides that continue to exist, and to develop a very complex system of government whereby one grouping controlled the presidency and another controlled the Speaker of the House, and all. It's quite a kind of complex arrangement. There are the special tribunals for Lebanon, but they're not looking at a wide range of crimes. So it's those divides and those tensions continue to bubble under the surface. So I think what I bring to the work at Fortify Rights and our work on Myanmar in particular is that idea that we must document so that these things can be addressed in the future.
Right. So that's an interesting twofold strategic way of working that you have, of both working on what's happening now with an eye towards the future on the day after. And I think this is something that has also come so clear to me in the many dozens of conversations we've done with any number of Burmese, is this sense of just like, how do we set up a system so this doesn't happen again? Yes, we have to win these current battles, but that's almost not as urgent, as important as wanting to make sure this doesn't unravel in the next 5 or 10 years, and looking at what we can do to just stop this generational trauma and conflict from continuing to happen. And so that sheds a light on the on where those Burmese activists, human rights defenders, democracy proponents are coming into play there. And that brings us also the first question from the audience, which is looking at, which is acknowledging that before the coup, there, on the part of many Burmese, those not so politically inclined, there was not so much of an interest in politics among many, especially as the so-called transition period was starting to open up and offer new opportunities for some, not for everyone, but for some, that politics was something that many had the luxury and privilege of saying they weren't interested in. After the coup, that all changed, and there were harder decisions that had to be made. And many Burmese have, who are not immediately serving in the PDFs or in the jungle or physically fighting, are looking at these questions of democracy, of human rights, of free speech, of nonviolent resistance, of these others, and which is awesome and is laudable, and yet also is extremely dangerous, and do not have the privileges that you or I have sitting here of what we're able to do. And so the question that comes is, what, looking at the context now of those Burmese in the country that are trying to work in a similar direction of the work that you're doing here, but under extreme risks, and probably not without any of the training that the many like yourself were so fortunate to have been through. What advice or guidance would you have for those individuals?
It's a really interesting question, and I think I'd start by saying that this kind of feeling of not being interested in politics, being unaware, is common throughout the world. But I particularly see it actually here in Thailand, because I think that the politics here is such a headache. I mean, we're going through now another period of instability. We'll see what happens. But I think it's been such a headache over the years, and it has been so unstable that kind of people want to shield themselves from that stress and from that chaos. But I don't know who said it, but I think it's a good saying that you might not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you. And so regardless of what your approach to all of this is, it will affect you. And the Myanmar people have found that out, obviously, in a terrible fashion. But I think that even sitting here in Thailand, every time you go to the grocery shop, that's politics. Depending the price of the onions and the bread that you're buying, it's all determined by politics. What's happening in Ukraine is massively shot up the price of grain, and oil markets in the world are going crazy, and so all of this has an impact on everyone's daily life. So I think that it's not really a choice to be uninterested in politics, in my mind, anyways. My advice, gosh, that's a difficult question. I don't think I'm necessarily in the right place to give advice to those people who are literally fighting for their lives and their freedom and their democracy. I think that, they're in a much better place to advise me about how I can advocate for them effectively. And that's what we do at Fortify Rights. And again, why, I'm proud of what we do is that we speak and we work alongside all kinds of different actors, working inside Myanmar, whether that is ethnic resistance organizations, humanitarian organizations, human rights defenders. We are in constant contact with them, and we also try and align our advocacy as much as we can, and we support their advocacy, and we try and champion their voices to the extent that we can. And so I really don't think that I'm in a position to give advice so much. But what I would say, just from my history and going back to that previous question about what I've taken from my experiences elsewhere, is that what needs to happen in Myanmar is long-term accountability, and that doesn't mean a victor's justice. So in the event that the NUG comes out victorious, there shouldn't be retribution towards those who didn't align themselves with the resistance, or who, through working with the junta, but not in a military kind of work. There shouldn't be vengeance, basically, is what I'm saying. There shouldn't be vigilante vengeance. There needs to be a rigorous process of understanding the crimes that have taken place and who is responsible for those crimes. And so I think that is the message that I would humbly pass on to our friends and allies in the resistance movement inside Myanmar.
And so you spoke just now of some of the projects that you've taken on with Fortify Rights. The Fortify Rights as an organization has also proceeded with, and that segues into our next question, which also comes from the audience, and that is looking at if you can describe some of the the successes that your actual implementation of projects has had, things that you could, I think that my sense is this question is coming from a sense that often organizations can say they're working towards things or they're making something a priority, but I think this question is driving at what real successes from actual implementation can be described from some of Fortify Rights efforts.
Yeah, another excellent question. And I used to be in the position where I was collecting all the data to actually show what we were achieving and how we were achieving it. And it was a fascinating job because we have a very complex system of documenting exactly what we're doing, when we're doing it, and what impact that those actions have. And it was really interesting to see how our theory of change, I don't want to get too technical, but basically we don't implement projects at Fortify Rights, but we have a strategic framework and we have a program of activities that we do. But we don't have like projects that, classical NGO might take on that starts on this date and ends on that date and has this metrics to judge success or failure. We have an ongoing strategy that we're implementing in the countries that we're working in. And we have three things that we do. And it's our theory of change, as I said. We investigate, we engage, and we strengthen. So we investigate, we do the classic kind of human rights investigations on the ground, talking to people who are affected, talking to governments, talking to different stakeholders, but also increasingly using open source and multimedia and satellite technology, all those kinds of things that the human rights world is looking more and more into. The advocacy, is what we call engage work. So that's the stuff that I'm helping out with a lot. So that's getting that information into the hands of courts, into the hands of governments, into the hands of corporates sometimes, whoever is in a position to change the problematic laws, policies and practices that we are seeing. And then the final element is the strengthening work. And so that's where our partners in Myanmar and elsewhere come in. Because we are all based in the countries that we're working on, and we're predominantly from those countries, and we kind of see it as a responsibility to be a part of the community, to be a part of the civil society in those places, and as part of that role to strengthen their work and for them to strengthen our work and kind of have this ongoing exchange. And so we do those three things. And a really fascinating thing that I saw when I was doing that monitoring evaluation work was how those three things combine to then make outcomes and impacts. And we have a massive amount of data. I was in charge of changing our system from a Excel file-based system to a cloud-based system because the Excel kept on failing, basically. It was too heavy. People couldn't open the file because we have so much data on what we do. And so now we have this cloud-based system, which is a lot more effective. So I can't really go through all of the different things that we've accomplished over the years. But I think for Myanmar in particular, we can point to, our work being cited by governments, by courts, by various actors, UN Special Rapporteurs, the Human Rights Council, as indications that people are paying attention to what we're writing and what we're saying. And that is starting to influence them. And that's what we call an outcome at Fortify Rights, some kind of external acknowledgement of the work that we're doing and the importance of that work. Because I think that that's the first step towards actual change. It's not the change that we want to see necessarily, but it's an indication that we're on the right path. And then when we say that we've made an impact, it's quite a high bar. It's when we've actually changed a law or a policy or a practice of a government or a corporate actor in some instances. But usually we're talking about governments and states. And we've had, I can't remember the figures, but hundreds of impacts, where we can legitimately argue. And it's never entirely straightforward, the causal link between you doing something and then the government doing something, because they will never acknowledge that it was Fortify Rights that changed their mind or forced them into a position where they had to change their minds about something. Very rarely, very, very rarely have we had that in one instance, we had that, which was a very proud moment for all of us when the United States government made their declaration of genocide in the instance of the Rohingya, which was back in the previous administration. Anthony Blinken was the Secretary of State. I can't remember exactly what year it was now, 2024, I think. And in his speech that he made at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, he actually mentioned our documentation work alongside others, which is, really great. And that is, a real, a clear acknowledgement that our work is breaking through and has changed the position of the US government, which is pretty huge for a small organization of less than 30 human rights defenders. So I think that would be one instance where our work has really broken through and we've seen an impact. But, I think that we see impacts in all kinds of different places as well, not just at that level, but also, I've got colleagues who apply for emergency grant money, for instance, when people are in desperate situations. They are a journalist escaping a criminal arrest warrant from the junta, so on trumped up charges, obviously, and they need to escape desperately. Otherwise, they're going to disappear into a jail for God knows how long. And so, being awarded that grant money from these emergency funds that exist out there and helping those people to apply and to, kind of shepherd them through that process, which can be quite daunting for, anyone really, but especially someone who is fleeing for their lives. That is, almost equally rewarding as some of those really high level impacts that we've made. And so, doing that kind of protection work essentially. And I don't do it directly, but seeing my colleagues doing that work is very, very impressive and rewarding. And it's something that we don't shout about because we can't, it's very secure. It's very, 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 what's the word? We have to have a very strong security focus when we're doing that kind of work, and the privacy of the people that we're assisting in those instances is obviously paramount. So we don't talk about it very publicly, but I can mention it kind of abstractly here now. So I think that is, and we help. I think I think it's around $500,000 that we raised, or we applied for through those emergency grants in the wake of the coup, in the first kind of year and a half or something. I think that it was. We got about $500,000 for people who needed to escape urgently and needed to be relocated or resettled. And so that is a great achievement that I can take no credit for, but my colleagues can. On the advocacy front, it's really difficult and it's hard work. And as I said, the international system is kind of collapsing around our feet at the moment, and it's difficult to see a clear route out. And it's difficult sometimes to know now who is on the side of human rights and justice and who isn't. And so we've had to do a bit of a kind of re-collaboration of our thinking, I think, and our strategy. Previously the US would have been our first port of call. It still is a very, very, very important player, but it's not necessarily a credible player anymore in terms of international human rights, and it's withdrawn itself from the Human Rights Council. It's sanctioned the International Criminal Court justices, and it's even brought in this banning order in the United States that prevents groups that are registered in the United States, including Fortify Rights, from even having any interaction with the International Criminal Court. And so that has been a real disabling and destabilizing element of this second Trump administration. And it's something that our CEO is personally suing the administration for in the US.
Right, that's heavy. Those are heavy topics. I want to move to the work that Fortify Rights and you personally have been doing in looking at the airstrikes that have been hitting Myanmar and your documentation. What updates can you give us about really how terrible and how bad this has gotten and what we're seeing on the ground from airstrikes?
Yeah. So tomorrow at the Foreign Correspondents Club, we will be launching our new report, which is covering the issue of airstrikes inside Myanmar. And I can, I don't want to put a spoiler out there for those of you who are going to attend tomorrow, but basically what we've done is look at 10 separate instances of aerial attacks against civilians in Karenni and Kachin states. And what we have documented is a systematic pattern of indiscriminate attacks through airstrikes that have claimed hundreds of civilian lives, very young children, very elderly people, internally displaced people, airstrikes that have targeted churches harboring refugees, IDP camps, hospitals and schools. And what we've seen is an intensification of airstrikes on civilian targets, particularly in these two states that we've been working in, but also in many other areas of the country as well. And that campaign of airstrikes, which is enabled and funded to a large extent by an international supply chain and international network of financiers who continue to work with the junta and who we talk about their complicity in the report, corporate complicity in crimes against humanity, war crimes. We've seen the intensification of these airstrikes as a result of the kind of series of coordinated attacks by the NUG-aligned forces, essentially against junta forces, and junta forces losing ground on the battlefield, and then responding in the way that they uniquely can, with the air supremacy, obviously complete air supremacy, basically, that they hold, but also with the same vicious and horrific and really awful kind of counterinsurgency tactics that is the MO of the Myanmar military, and so not going after legitimate military targets as is allowed under international law, but instead deliberately targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure as a way to terrorize the population, as a way to beat them into submission, essentially, and to try and stymie any support that is being given to the resistance. And what we're also flagging through that report, and with the upcoming elections, is that these, I even kind of shudder at calling them elections. They will not be elections in any sense of the word. But these sham elections that they have planned for December, what we can clearly see through those plans and through the fact that they've lifted the nationwide state of emergency, but they've kept the state of emergency in place for specific states and regions and divisions within Myanmar, where they're facing resistance, obviously, is that we will likely see that these places will be basically beaten into submission into the junta's plans, unless the international community does something about the situation. They are going to be subjected to the most vicious campaign of pacification, essentially, through aerial bombardment. And we're seeing the kind of the origins of this and the start of this already in Karenni and Kachin states and what we've documented. And so I think we're flagging for the international community that finally something must be done to prevent this level of civilian death and destruction. And we're pointing to ways that can be done. We are recommending that the Security Council finally act. I mean, we have had a Security Council resolution already, but it was non-binding. And so we need another one that can actually be implemented by the international community. And we need an arms embargo, and we need, very importantly, a aviation fuel embargo on the junta in response to these crimes that we've documented. And, the crimes that other groups have documented and the United Nations has consistently been talking about as well. And so we do need that action. And then obviously, as I mentioned, accountability, long-term accountability is extremely important for us, and is a major strategic focus of ours. And so what we've done as well is named 22 commanders within the Myanmar military and Air Force who we believe should be held accountable for their role in ordering airstrikes on civilians in Kachin and Karenni states.
Right. So looking at these horrific airstrikes that are hitting many civilian centers, and I should add that a previous interview we did, the guest brought out another rationale for why so many civilian centers, especially hospitals and schools, are being targeted, is that they represent the ability of the resistance forces to administer themselves. And so you're not just beating people into submission, but you're also beating in local governance structures and tearing them apart, which some outside analysts are only too happy to poke holes into the problems of rebel governance and a situation that couldn't be more complex. But then, we have this sham election that is also playing into it, wanting to take more ground at whatever cost, not really caring if anyone's left to live there, but just wanting to be increasing the percentage of the country that one is administering. And, you mentioned just now that, I can't remember your exact words, but the urgency with which to bring this to the international community, that now is a time to really act with this. I hate to say this and go back, but I feel like I've been hearing that line 4.5 years. I remember months after the coup talking to different individuals from various organizations. I remember a specific conversation I had just a couple months after the coup, asking someone who had a background with RTP, what line has this military not crossed yet, that if they cross that line, then we might see from the international community, now they've gone too far. And the guy put his hands up and said, I can't really think of, they've done this. We're talking about over 4 years ago. And so, with we can only plead and cry with urgency so much. But as you say, this international system is, we're in a different kind of system now than we've been in the past. And that's something we have to acknowledge. And I think that some organizations and individuals have been a bit slow to coming around to realizing that those international systems don't quite work the way that we'd like them to, or that we're used to in the past. Seeing the reality of how they actually work. And this is something that has been part and parcel of this conversation that you've brought in from the very first minutes. And looking at, and I should also reference, I'm thinking of a conversation I had with James Rodehouver of the UN some bit ago, where when I put this question to him, he said, and looking at why it's not there, he said it comes back to political will. It's that you have to create that political will from the international community. Everyone knows what's going on. They see it. It's deplorable, but where is the political will to focus and to activate and to bring that to attention? So looking at the reality of where this international context is going, and even if we're not quite sure, the rise of Russia and China, the U.S. At best being negligent, at worst maybe engaging on the wrong side of things and actually being a bad actor, and either indifference from other countries, or concern with what's right at their doorstep and looking at other conflicts, or their own politics. These kind of right-wing authoritarian politics are taking shape everywhere. Looking at that reality, as much as I respect and acknowledge and agree with this urgency and these flags that you're raising, what can be done if the international order has changed to the extent that it has? And if this kind of work relies on and rests on consensus among international bodies, which is no longer there, then where does this leave these calls for urgency?
It's a very difficult question. And there are lots of different layers to it. I think what I like about doing the work that we do at Fortify Rights and working in international law is there is a clarity there. We can look at not only the activity, the abuses that have happened since the coup, but the behavior of the Myanmar military pre-coup, whether that is suppression of ethnic minorities, genocide of the Rohingya, engaging in all kinds of different abuses. And then obviously since the coup, what we've documented and what the United Nations and others have talked about is crimes against humanity and war crimes. So from a legal perspective, it's clear, they have committed genocide, they have committed crimes against humanity, they have committed war crimes. These are the most serious crimes that we have on the books at an international level. And if the international community doesn't act on that, then I don't know what it will act on, So, and that's where the politics comes in, obviously. But I think from a legal perspective, if there isn't action to get accountability for what the Myanmar military have done over the years, pre and post coup, then the international order again, takes another massive hit in terms of its integrity and its suitability, essentially. And I think the other thing that I like about international law is there is that clarity about what's right and wrong. And I think that's sometimes, or that's not forgotten, but it's purposefully obfuscated and ignored within the political dialogue that we have on Myanmar. It's never right to bomb a hospital. It's never right to bomb a school. It's never right to kill civilians in times of war. International law is very, very clear about that. And yet that happens, and you have Myanmar's neighbors, particularly Thailand and China and India, making apologies for the junta's actions or just completely denying that they're happening, and denying the crisis that's happening inside of Myanmar, denying the death and destruction, the persecution, and continuing to work with the regime. From a legal perspective, completely wrong, goes against everything that countries themselves have signed up to. And I think that's an important factor that often gets lost, is that sovereign states have agreed to be part of this system, have signed up to treaties, have signed up to customary international law, abide by various elements of international law, as long as it doesn't seem to kind of touch on their core interests, and then they make excuses as to why they can't abide by those elements. But, the international economic system is based on international law. The shipping system is based on international law. The way we define our borders and territories is based on international law. So if you sign up to all of those things, you have to also then sign up to human rights and international humanitarian law. You can't go at this piecemeal. You have to take it all, otherwise none of it. And that's what we're talking about. In Myanmar, in Gaza, in Ukraine, in the various conflicts that are happening right now. And I think that is what gets lost in the political discussion, is there is a responsibility of the international community, all of the international community, not just the West, not just the United States, but Thailand, India, China, the other countries of Southeast Asia. There is a responsibility for them to act on the abuses that have happened inside Myanmar. In particular, genocide. Genocide, if you're a signatory to the Genocide Convention, which many states are, there is a legal obligation for you to act to prevent and address the crime of genocide. But also crimes against humanity, war crimes, again, there are legal obligations on the parts of states to address those and to prevent them from happening. And yet, the politics is that much of the world is turning a blind eye to Myanmar and what's happening. And that's what we can't do more than we are doing to document and to talk about that. And if people listen, great. If they don't, well, they'll have to deal with the consequences afterwards. If you like the Thai government, my government does, if you want to just ignore the reality of what's happening next door, if you want to ignore the reality of the regime that is trying to install itself through sham elections at the end of this year, and actually the Thai government is supporting those elections and supporting that regime, actively supporting, then, don't come crying to the international community when you have an unstable, unpredictable actor on your border that you can't manage anymore. And I think that's what we've seen in Cambodia, in the conflict with Cambodia, is that, that's come back to bite us here in Thailand. Putting up with Hun Sen and putting up with his politics and the way he goes about it we're gonna have to learn a lesson from that. We have to have good neighborly relations in Thailand with our neighbors. Yes, obviously, that's important from a security perspective. That's important from a political perspective. But what serves our long-term national interests in Thailand. And I would argue that it doesn't serve our long-term national interest in Thailand to just ignore horrific crimes and genocide that's happening on our doorstep here. So Thailand and the others of Myanmar neighbors and Southeast Asian nations, they all need to step up. And ASEAN's response to the coup initially seemed quite hopeful. They came out with this 5-point consensus, but the consensus quickly dissolved into nothing, basically. And there hasn't been any consequences for that. So obviously the junta will continue to push, just like I have a 1-year-old child, 1.5-year-old child now, and you can see it. If you don't set boundaries and reinforce those boundaries, then they're going to push and push and push and see how far that they can push it. And if there are no consequences for bad behavior, then obviously, then they will continue to do whatever they want. And we're seeing that globally. Bad actors are getting away with terrible abuses of human rights, genocide, the worst international crimes. And as long as there's impunity and there's no consequences for those crimes, then obviously they're going to continue to do whatever they want to do. But accountability can take many forms, and it can take legal forms, but it will also take political forms. And so ASEAN excluding Myanmar to a certain extent, maybe that is a good thing that they've excluded the junta from certain meetings. It's a kind of social sanction is what ASEAN diplomats tell me, and it's the kind of strongest thing that they will be willing to do. So it's a step forward, at least. But ASEAN really needs to think about how to deal with these kinds of situations, because as we've seen with the situation between Thailand and Cambodia, instability is quite common in this region, actually. People think of Southeast Asia as a vibrant economic hub, a vibrant place for tourism, and it is those things, but it's also a region that has faced a fair amount of instability in its history. And given the very fragmented and kind of conflictual situation at a global level, it's a region that will, kind of gets buffeted by all of the winds that are happening, that are flowing around the world at any one time. And so I think if ASEAN wants to continue to be a useful regional actor, it needs to think very, very hard about these kinds of situations and how it's going to react to it. On top of that, I think that we need to have more leadership from the United Nations. The Secretary General has barely spent any time, I think, thinking and talking about what's happening in Myanmar. And that is a real shame. Julie Bishop as well, the Special Envoy of the Secretary General, has been largely absent, I'd say. I haven't really seen much impact of her work. So again, it's very unfortunate. I think we have seen some leadership from, OHCHR, from the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and a constant documentation of what's going on and constant advocacy for the international community to act. But that top-level leadership, that top-level strategic direction has been missing from the United Nations approach to the situation. And I think that we can see that, again, globally, the United Nations seems and feels to be a bit lost in the current situation. It doesn't know where it can be useful, and it has been largely sidelined from the big international crises that we are living through. So whether it survives as a useful international actor or not, it will largely depend on its performance in these kinds of situations. The Security Council is ineffective as well at the moment, especially on Myanmar, because you have China, who essentially sees Myanmar as its backyard and as its, it's almost its sovereign right to veto resolutions on Myanmar. That's not to let the other members of the Security Council off the hook, and the UK in particular, as the kind of responsible, they call them the pen holder on Myanmar, so the country responsible for drafting resolutions, it has also been slow and rather ineffectual at that level, unfortunately, in its response. We do have that resolution at the Security Council, that non-binding resolution, and I know that was took a lot of effort, and it is historic in many respects, but it's really not enough to bring about any kind of pressure, real pressure, on the junta to stop its crimes.
That's a grim overall picture that you give us, and I think it also, at the same time, to balance that out, I think it also reinforces the voices that we hear, and on this platform in particular, I hear so often of Burmese that have just been so fed up with so many international systems, and even fed up with the NUG, and yet that disappointment has not caused them to check out or to not be involved, but to just put all the more passion into whatever it is they're doing, whether they're in a PDF or whether they're medics or doing education or helping IDPs or whatever they are in their localized area. There's just been a sentiment I've heard from so many individuals that have been that are almost not even following this anymore, almost not even their concern. That let them all do, let those institutions all do, and even the NUG leadership, let them all do what they do. Our loss of faith in whatever those activities are is no longer falling into criticism or disappointment. It's falling into diversion of just we're gonna take the agency and we're gonna do what we do best, right in front of us and what we're involved in.
Yes, I think I agree with you. I think that's been a really encouraging development and a reaction, I suppose, to the ineffectiveness of the international response to what's happening in Myanmar. Is that, people in the NUG and at state and region level inside Myanmar have really knuckled down and have started to do the hard yards about thinking about, how can we run this country? How can we run public services? How can we resist? How can we, how can we build a better future? And I am also a senior research fellow at the Chiang Mai University School of Public Policy, and there's a lot of work being done there by brilliant Myanmar students about the future of Myanmar. What various things ranging from telecommunications to energy sector to healthcare look like in a post-revolutionary Myanmar, and I congratulate and I'm very impressed by a lot of the thinking and acting that is happening in that regard. The only thing I would say, though, is that, again, if you're not interested in international politics will be interested in you. And so the NUG and its allies, they shouldn't check out from the international arena. Because if they do that, then they are, and I think they know this, then they're kind of toast. Because the forces of the international allies of the junta, their forces are kind of coalescing now around this idea of sham elections, a regime that is, a complete facade of democracy, and recognition of that regime. And so when the elections happen, we will see Thailand, we will see India, we will see China coming out and recognizing those elections, most likely. And they will recognize the results, and then they will, completely normalize their relations with the junta. And there will be a temptation for others to fall in on that. ASEAN, other Asian nations, Japan, Korea, maybe even some Europeans. They might think, well, we've made enough of a stink about everything that's happening. Maybe we just need to try and normalize things, and maybe we can convince them. But that argument was made about previous Myanmar regimes that were also puppets for the military. That we know that it's not perfect, but we will convince them, we will change them. They are open to change, blah, blah, blah. We've seen it in the past.
Yeah.
The same mistakes cannot happen again. We mustn't have history repeating itself inside Myanmar.
Yeah, absolutely. And referencing the Thai-Myanmar relations and Thailand's role in this, it's another one of those cases. There's a lot of nuance there. It's not necessarily so monolith in terms of which forces in Thailand are acting in which different ways. Also confusing, also undergoing changes. But one of the questions that's coming from the audience that's going back to relating to what you mentioned about airstrikes is this possibility of a humanitarian corridor on the Myanmar side of the border where assistance can be provided, some kind of protected area that is on the Thai-Myanmar border that is recognized and supported by Thailand and the international community. What have you heard of this? What do you know? What do you think of this idea? And where could it be located?
Yes, the idea of safe zones has always been kind of mooted during this crisis and in previous, crises and around the world. But obviously, the history of safe zones is quite problematic and tragic. The kind of the case study, obviously, is Srebrenica. In the Yugoslav conflict, where a safe zone that was guarded by Dutch military soldiers was not safe, and the Serbs came in and massacred thousands of Muslim men and boys. And so I think, taking that example as a cautionary tale would, I think, for many, dissuade you from going down that route. And it has that effect for me as well. And I don't think that in Thailand we have the political will, political environment, and security situation to a large extent to establish a safe zone. So, and I don't think it's a sustainable solution. I think that a better sustainable solution is for Thailand to have a proper asylum system for refugees. A legal process by which a person can gain protective status in Thailand. And that's something that the Thai government consistently rejects. It set up this thing called the national screening mechanism, which is, if it wasn't so tragic, it would be a joke. They have screened out far more refugees, including Myanmar refugees, than they are screening into this national screening mechanism. They've only given protected status to a handful of people since it's been in power, in position. It is a failure of the Thai government not to have a system for seeking asylum. It's a human right to seek asylum. But it's also Thailand's international obligation and responsibility to provide safety to anyone who is fleeing violence and persecution. And so really it's a dereliction of Thailand's duty in that regard to not have a proper system of registering and documenting and providing protection to refugees. So I would say that is the more sustainable and actually the safer way of having a safe zone, is that if Thailand had an asylum system, then the entire country of Thailand would be a safe zone for refugees, but it is not, and it hasn't been since the coup. It's a very difficult and dangerous place for Myanmar refugees to continue to eke out a living and to survive. I've spoken to countless refugees who are living in the shadows here, with no documentation, with no legal opportunities to work or gain education or healthcare, and consistently being exploited and consistently being extorted by Thai authorities. It is not a safe haven for refugees at all, and that needs to change. As I said, it's Thailand's responsibility to offer asylum to people who are seeking it. And the NSM, the National Screening Mechanism, isn't a system for that, despite what the government says at a global level. And until they have that system, then people will continue to live in the shadows and work in the grey and black economy, essentially. And Thailand doesn't want that. It's not good for Thailand. It's not good for Thai workers. It's not good for the Thai economy. So that needs to be addressed. I think in terms of humanitarian corridors, again, that has been discussed both on the Thai side of the border and also more recently on the Bangladesh border with Rakhine State because of the desperate situation in that area of the country at the moment, is difficult, and especially with a lack of leadership from the United Nations on it. The Secretary General did go to Bangladesh recently and talked with Mohammed Yunus, the interim Prime Minister of Bangladesh, about establishing a humanitarian corridor, but subsequently it's gone very quiet, and I think there are lots of sensitivities around Bangladesh's relations with the Arakan Army, who is the ethnic resistance organization that is largely in control of Rakhine State now. And so again, because the junta isn't really in control of the borders, governments are going to have to work with ethnic resistance organizations, PDFs, and other actors if they want to do that. So it's diplomatically very challenging for those neighbors of Myanmar. Practically, there are difficulties, and without proper leadership from the United Nations politically, it's very, very, very difficult as well.
Right. You speak of the AA, and that's a good prompt for going into some of the work that Fortify Rights has done to shine a light on the concerns of some of AA's behavior. But I want to frame the question from a slightly different angle, and that's that when we're looking at this subject of independent journalism or human rights documentation, there's a sensitive argument that on one hand there's a pushback against this both sidesism, that there could be a framing of problems that are happening on the military side, which are so atrocious and so beyond the pale, and then on the resistance side, which the numbers are just in many cases are just not there on the military issues, and so a concern about fitting into that narrative. But then on the other side, there's also a concern that there could be some pushback of saying, well, let's just all win the revolution and then we'll talk about all this later. Let's not get bogged in these kind of details and then we'll get there. And then others that have stood up and said, like, if we're not fighting, if this is not part of our revolution, then what is our revolution? If we're not doing things the right way and including these things in our process now, then what is it we're even really doing and being activated with? And so with this context behind, and probably more there that we could fill in, I'm curious about through the perspective of yourself and of Fortify Rights, why it's been so important to engage in this kind of documentation with AA and other resistance actors. In addition, obviously, all the military work you do, but if you can mention something about your own beliefs and priorities as to why you're doing this work, and then also the nature of the criticism that you've received for this and how you've then responded to that criticism, and probably the greater care and sensitivity you have to bring when you have the military, which is such a bad actor. You paint them any which way, it's going to be true. You're not going to go too far, but the more care and precision and sensitivity you have when you're talking about these concerns with the resistance actors.
So again, I think the thing that I love about the law is that it doesn't take sides. It applies equally to everyone. And that is the case in Myanmar just as it is elsewhere. So if we see that an actor is committing a violation of international humanitarian law, specifically in the Myanmar context, we will document that, regardless of who that is. And we've done not just work on the AA, but we've done work on the PDFs, and we've done work on Karenni, the Karenni forces under the KNU. That was a kind of a turning point, actually, in our work, is when we documented a massacre by the KNDO, I'm going to misremember the name, but the Karen Nationalities Defense Organization, which was an element of the KNU, the Karen National Union forces in Karen State. We documented a massacre committed by them back in 2021, I'd say 2022, around the beginning of the revolution. They claimed that they had arrested a group of around 20 junta spies. They said that they were working on a construction site near to their camp, but they'd noticed that they were observing their camp, and they weren't acting as normal construction workers acted. And then they arrested them and they held them at their camp, and then their camp was subsequently stormed by junta troops, and in the melee, these people were all killed. So we investigated that, and we even managed to speak with the commander of the KNDO, who admitted on the call to having massacred these people, which is quite an astounding moment for us as human rights researchers. But he made the argument that, well, if we hadn't killed them, they would have gone back to the junta troops, told them about our position, told them about our numbers, and they would have come and killed us all. So we had to kill them. So it's this kind of wartime logic that we get faced with a lot. And it's understandable. It's horrific, but we understand that war is very messy. It's brutal. It's awful. But international law does allow for a large level of that awfulness to occur. But there are limits. There must remain limits. There must remain law. Even in the chaos of war, there must be limits to what actors can do. And so that's what we are there to try and remind those different actors, whether they are PDFs or NUG affiliates or others, obviously the conflict, we're not a pacifist organization. We don't have a view on the conflict as such, but we have a view on how the conflict is conducted. And I think that's an important, argument that we make, and we remind EROs about that. And so, we did that research, and then subsequently we've been researching the behavior of the Arakan army. Now, I think that the situation in Rakhine is somewhat different from other states and regions of Myanmar, in that we have that history of genocide, and we have that history of intercommunal conflicts and tensions. And I think that's what's playing out to a large extent in the Arakan army's behavior, and equally the Rohingya people's fear now, real palpable fear of the Arakan army. And what we've documented over the past couple of years is quite systematic abuses. Attacks on Rohingya civilians by the Arakan army, use of drones and artillery strikes on civilian sites, an unfortunate trend of beheading of civilians, seemingly to instigate terror in civilian communities, imprisonment, arbitrary detention, torture in those sites of arbitrary detention by AA troops as well. And so, there is a real gravity to the crimes that the Arakan army are committing. And I think it would be wrong of a human rights organization not to speak out about crimes on that level. And so that's why we have documented that. But yeah, you're right, we've faced quite a bit of pushback on that. And I don't think the NUG has said anything, actually, publicly at least, about the situation with the Arakan army. And I think that's to their detriment, and I think that really weakens their position. So we would like to see the NUG come out publicly and condone or condemn even the Arakan army's actions in that regard. So, yeah, we have faced pushback for doing that documentation, but as I said, I think it would be derelict of us not to do that documentation. And when we speak to Rohingya refugees inside Bangladesh, who we regularly interact with, they now kind of think of the Arakan army as equal a threat, if not more so, of a threat to them and to their survival within Rakhine State than the Myanmar military. So that's really tells a lot about the current situation, the gravity of the crimes that the AA is committing. And so we continue to document those crimes, but we also continue to interact to a certain extent with the Arakan army because they exist within a democratic structure. They exist within the NUG's kind of system of allies. And so we hope to continue to be able to influence their behavior. We've kind of given up hope influencing the Myanmar military's behavior. We've instead, we've looked to influence the international community's position on the Myanmar military, obviously, but I think we're also doing this documentation for that long-term accountability that we hope to see in the future. But we don't interact with the Myanmar military for various reasons, but also because, practically speaking, I don't think that we would have any success in any advocacy towards the Myanmar military. Whereas for the Arakan Army, we do hold out some hope that maybe maybe they can change their approach. Maybe they can properly investigate what their troops are doing on the ground, bring in new people, new policies and practices, and also to allow and to cooperate with international investigators. We will see. I mean, that might be politically naive or wrong of us to continue to hold on to that hope, but that's our current situation. But we will also continue to rigorously document the crimes that the Arakan Army are committing against Rohingya, who are in a really terrible and desperate situation, kind of the worst in many respects since the genocidal attacks of 2017. And it's actually what the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees said yesterday in a report, that what the human rights community is documenting in Rakhine State now has echoes of 2017. So it's a really desperate situation, and it's something that needs to be addressed both at that very local level by the actors on the ground, but also at the international level. And we have a major conference happening at the end of this month in New York on the Rohingya crisis, being led by the Bangladeshi authorities, where we hope that there'll be real political will to address some of these problems and provide sustainable solutions to the Rohingya.
Right. So the last question I would like to ask you here, it also comes from the audience, and I think this is giving us a good kind of summation or reflection on where this conversation has been. And that's that as a human rights defender, if you have the chance to advocate to Myanmar's elected government, what would you prioritize? And there are some lists some options that are given here. I think that this is really we can see this as the beginning of a list. I think there's a lot more things we could put on, and I think there's certainly a case for every single one of these being at the very top of that list. So I don't envy your task of having to pick these apart, but that would include things like transitional justice, social well-being, IDPs, refugees, human security. Some of the things mentioned here, obviously many more we could put on there. If you were in this position, how would you go about thinking as to what you would then prioritize and put near the top of that list?
It's actually quite easy to answer this, and maybe it's because I'm a human rights defender, but I would say prioritize human rights, because human rights speaks to all of those things. Human rights isn't just about the war crimes and crimes against humanity that we are seeing happen every day inside Myanmar. It's not just about refugees that we've spoken a lot about. It's not just about freedom of speech and those kind of issues that often are in the media agenda, but it's also about public services. It's about healthcare. It's about education. It's about livelihoods. It's about workers' rights. It's about freedom of movement, even freedom of communication, the right to leisure. Human rights is a very all-encompassing agenda for governments to follow, and I would just recommend that the NUG look at the wonderful body of human rights law and jurisprudence that we have built over the half century that we've had kind of this modern system of more than half century of modern human rights law, and use that as a kind of framework for their governing agenda. I do hope one day that there will be a democratic government in Myanmar that is able to effectuate that agenda. We have the NUG, which we recognize as the legitimate, government of Myanmar with the right to make decisions about the country's future, the right to make laws, the right to issue directives and policies. But obviously, given the current situation on the ground in Myanmar, the NUG's ability to effectuate those things is somewhat limited. But if they were to come to power one day, I would say they have to have a human rights first agenda, which would encompass all of those things.
Yeah.
But equally, I would say that they need to address the aspirations and the needs of the people of Myanmar. And in my conversations and in our conversations with people from Myanmar, that really does include justice. That really does include accountability. Because I think that they know, as well as any of us from outsiders and in the international community know, if we brush these abuses that have happened under the carpet, if we continue to deny that there has been genocide, there are crimes against humanity, there are war crimes happening, then there won't be any stability inside Myanmar in the long run. And those governing kind of agenda points can't be addressed anyways. So human rights, accountability, I think that those need to be the priority for a democratic government of Myanmar.
So with that, I thank you for having this really excellent conversation and our inaugural podcast before a live audience, which has really been a thrill, and to bring in questions from people out there.
It's been great to have the audience participation, so thank you very much for coming out and for bearing with us today. I would recommend that you all check out Fortify Rights' website, fortifyrights.org, for all of our documentation on Myanmar and the other countries that we work in. No, it's been lovely speaking with you and having this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to this show. I know that it can be easy to feel overwhelmed and powerless in the face of the horrors that continue to unfold in Myanmar. But even just the mere act of staying informed is a powerful way to bear witness and keep focus on the issue. And this work is only made possible because of the generosity of donors and listeners like you. So if this episode has been valuable to you in any way, and you'd like to help us continue sharing these vital stories, please consider making a donation. Whether it's a one-time contribution or a monthly pledge, your help will translate into more episodes like the one you just heard. You can join our mission today by visiting insightmyanmar.org/donation or send us a message to learn more about the various options.